And Mark gets finished with this section, he doesn't talk about Judas ever again. This is it. You don't hear him anymore. The only reason we know about Judas is later on what we see John write about him, and later on what we see in Acts, what happens to him. But this will be the last that we hear from Judas in this section. So we're going to read the whole section this morning, but we're going to focus on verse 43. So if you turn to Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 43. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up and accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elder. Now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard." After coming, Judas immediately went to him, saying, "Rabbi," and kissed him. They laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures." And they all left him and fled. You know, we laugh at that part because we know that it's Peter who cut his ear off. But there's a point we all need to recognize. It's a whole lot easier to fight for Jesus than it is to die for him. And that's what a lot of Christians struggle with today. They're out there being evangelistic flag wavers on the street corner because it's a whole lot easier to fight for Christ than it is to sacrifice your life for him. And that's part of the problem today. And that's what we'll see as we go forward, that this whole section is about sacrifice. It's not about fighting at all. See, the devil doesn't want you to hear that. That's why he does things like that in the middle of when I say things. Because he doesn't want any of us to sacrifice ourselves for the Lord. He wants us out there fighting and doing things. You know why? Because at the bottom of all this, you know what the thing of it is? Think about this. Do you think Satan wanted Jesus to go to the cross? No. What did he want? He wanted all of his followers to rise up and fight and free Jesus from the cross. Do you see this? This is what you have to understand, this whole passage coming. The whole underlying thought of all of this. The devil didn't want Jesus to go to the cross. The reason why he's egging all of this on is to get all of these people into an uproar to stop the sacrifice of the great high priest. Because think, if they would have risen up and they would have caused a revolt and Jesus would have gotten away, he would have escaped, and none of the cross, none of it would have ever happened. That's exactly what Satan wanted. He never wanted Jesus to go to the cross. He wanted all of his followers to fight. But Jesus teaches us the greatest lesson of all. Sacrifice. Sacrifice. Let us not love with word, but rather with deed. Didn't we read that just a few moments ago? And to do a deed is to sacrifice. But today in our section, we're going to see one action. That's the title. One action. Really interesting verse in verse 43. It's very subject, verb, object. Very, very straightforward. There's only one verb in the whole verse. You look at it, verse 43, and it's came up. That's it. Everything else is prepositions, conjunctions, adjectives, nouns. It isn't even an imperative. It's not even commanding that anybody do anything. It's just an indicator of what happened. One action. A lot of people want to focus on the betrayal with the kiss, right? That's always the focus, right? Probably because Americans are so caught up with sex and love and all the rest, they can't get their mind out of the gutter for 25 seconds to think about what this verse is actually about. There wouldn't have been a kiss if Judas hadn't come there that night. But we know that the devil entered Judas, right? We know that. The Bible tells us that the devil entered into Judas and made him scurry around doing all these things. Judas is still responsible for it, though. His intentions aligned with that. But this one action, we look at verse 43. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a crowd. And basically this says that the state of things from now on would be changed forever. The state of things are going to be changed forever. In fact, Jesus is still talking to them, explaining his thoughts and explaining his mind, and Judas breaks in immediately, just shatters the entire sense of reality. And Jesus lets him do it. He lets him do it. Jesus could have gotten rid of him right there on the spot. What does he tell Peter later? Don't you think I could have called legions of angels and stopped all of this? But he doesn't. Because the state of things would be changed now and forever. In fact, Jesus was in the middle of disclosing his thoughts. And because of this, he's not going to do that anymore. You're not going to hear Jesus tell you his thoughts anymore. It's done. All of that is done. He's going to reveal a side of God that no one has ever seen. And if you've been studying along with us on Sunday nights, and if you've been coming on Sunday night, been here the last couple Sunday nights, staying online, we've been studying God. Just God, his character, who he is, what he is, qualities. And what we'll find out is that Jesus came to reveal who God is to us in the flesh. And he's about to reveal something about himself that no one ever knew or no one ever realized. God is a God who will sacrifice his most precious for the greatest benefit of all. But Jesus, who had come to show these things and these thoughts and these ideas to all of his followers and to all of us, no more of that. No more talking. No more words. No more discussion of his thoughts. In fact, as you go forward, you will see that Jesus doesn't discuss his mind, his plans, his thoughts anymore. He just responds to people in kind as they ask him questions. They wanted to get more information out of him, but he was not forthcoming with any of that. All of that had been shattered with Judas's one action of coming up there that night. Judas broke the plane of reality that was currently in existence. They could have come, right? Jesus says, you came to me in the market all the time. You came to me in the temple all the time. Now you're coming with swords and clubs. Forget it. Forget it. No more. If you're going to treat me like a criminal, then I'm not going to teach you anymore. That's what we see. So the state of things have now been changed. Mark uses some interesting language, right? Judas, one of the 12, right? Do we need to know that he's one of the 12? We kind of already know that. But Judas brings it up because Mark brings it up because Judas was able to get close to the Lord Jesus Christ, right? That's kind of his focus there, to show the world that Judas had access to the Lord that most people did not have, which is a very good thing to recognize, because a lot of people think that, oh, he's out in the wilderness, out in the trees, anybody could just walk right up to him. Well, that's not entirely true. You got to remember that while Jesus was doing all of this in Jerusalem, people were grouping up and more and more people were following him. So it wouldn't have just been just the 12 and Jesus is out in the forest somewhere. He's got a lot of people camped out at the bottom of the Mount of Olives. I mean, there's probably a couple thousand, maybe even more people just camped out around the base of the Mount of Olives where he was, because they knew that's where he was at. So it wouldn't be like these people could just walk right up and say hello. Jesus says, look, behold, here comes the one. And we see later on, John says that they're coming with torches and things to light up the night. And what we see is Jesus and his 12, his inner circle, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And around that are all the people who are his learners, his disciples, not his apostles. Remember, there's a different setting there. You have disciples who are learning from him. So at the base of the Mount of Olives, in the Garden of Gethsemane, you have Jesus and the 11 apostles, not counting Judas. But then he goes further into the garden. He takes 3 with him, so he's in further, and then he goes in further by himself. So he's in by himself, and then you have the 3, and then you have the remaining 8, and then you have the thousands of disciples that were there because of all of what he was doing in Jerusalem that week. Remember, this is Thursday. This is Thursday night. And since Monday, he'd been going back and forth to the temple, cleaning it out, and basically getting things riled up, right? People were getting riled up. And so when he comes back, there's a lot of people at the bottom here. So Judas knows that if he comes back, he's got to come back with, and what he ends up coming back with is about 600 soldiers. Not to mention some of the higher ranking guards and so on and so forth with torches, and they're armed. And they're armed. But the focus is that Judas is one of the 12, so he can get in and mark the target. Right? That's really what he's doing. Because there's a lot of things that are going on. No one else really could get that close because none of his other inner circle would do something this evil. And they needed someone who could point him out. So Jesus couldn't escape, right? That was the thing. With so many people there were, and obviously a lot of people, they were looking similar to Jesus. Followers, they took after Jesus. They want to wear, you know how it is. You get people who are followers of some popular person. They want to look like them. They want to talk like them. They want to act like them. So there are probably some disciples in the crowd who may have even been able to pass as a body double for Jesus. And they didn't want him to get away, so they needed somebody to point him out specifically. And they needed somebody who could get close to him so Jesus wouldn't escape. So Judas goes to them and says, look, I'll point you to the guy. No questions asked. But they also needed somebody to do this because they were such cowards, they wouldn't do it themselves, right? The Sanhedrin, the high priest, the lawyers, the elite class didn't want to get their hands dirty. Does that sound familiar? Because while they got everybody else arguing down at our level about different things, they're trying to keep your focus off of them. It's exactly what's going on here. They don't want to get their hands dirty. They were too cowardly. And you know what else? The Sanhedrin, the high priest, and the lawyers, they didn't trust anybody. We'll talk about the why in just a minute. They didn't trust anybody. They didn't even trust Judas. Judas could have been scamming them out of some money, right? They didn't even believe him. So all of these elite upper crusts of Jerusalem, yeah, they want to take a shot. They didn't want to do it at Passover. They didn't want to cause a riot. The Romans had already put down a couple of riots. So they needed somebody like Judas. But Judas came to them all on his own. Remember, we talked about this a while back. Nobody twisted his arm. Nobody asked him. He went on his own. So they didn't trust him. So he was out to prove him wrong. And like I had kind of already alluded to, he led a group of people to him with 2 things. The Bible tells us in 43, they came with swords and with clubs. Swords are obviously weapons to attack, right? The Markarian, the short sword that they would use to do damage. It was a short, double-edged sword, and the Romans were very adept at using those things. They knew where to poke and prod to do the most damage. Romans are very, very surgical that way. But then you see this word clubs. This is more so affiliated with the Jewish troops. As they wouldn't stab people, they would just bludgeon people. They didn't want to shed the blood. They kept it inside. But these were used basically to detain people. They were like clubs where they could twist people's arms, and in fact, in some places, they would use them to kind of hold prisoners' arms back. They were adept with using clubs and staffs and so forth to detain people. So Judas led a group of people who were ready to attack or to detain. Like that, Jesus never traveled with people like that. And Judas should have never been traveling with people like that. But this is what he has to realize and what he has to deal with. The point we have to realize is this, that Jesus is the indirect object of this whole sentence. When you look at it, it says, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, who is the subject of this sentence, this is all about Judas. This whole verse is about Judas. And who he was acting for, or in according to, was the chief priests, right? Because it says, who were from the chief priests. He came up from the chief priests. So if you were to cut this sentence down to its bare minimum and just kind of put it all together in its simplest form, this verse says Judas came from the high priests. That's basically what this simplest version of this verse is saying. He's associated himself with the high priest, which makes Jesus indirectly affected. He's indirectly affected by Judas's one action, which means everybody else is affected by Judas's action, and Jesus is affected indirectly. And as we go forward, we'll see that Judas had no idea what kind of an effect this would have on anybody. He had no idea. Most likely because he was only thinking of himself. The next thing we see is these people that he led. Who were they connected to? Right, we look at verse 43. It says they were the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Well, let's talk about them for a second. The chief priests were false religious leaders. At this point, in around the early 200s of BC, right? Alexander the Great, right? We're talking about all these things and the kings and the Seleucid Empire and so on and so forth. By this time, they had taken over the power in the Holy Land. And so the chief priests, they used to have to be from the line of Aaron, and then they were family line, and they would keep going according to what the scripture said. But by around 200 BC, after everything had kind of happened with Jewish revolts, all of that stopped. And the high priestly office became an office that you could buy. You could pay for it. So starting around 200 BC, between 200 BC, or 191 to be technical, 200 BC to 70 AD, in that little span of 300 years, that gap, there were 28 high priests. 28. And you figure, well, in 300 years, that's only like 4 generations, if you really want to get down to it, right? Like a father, and then his son, and then his son, and then his son. That could span, maybe even 8 at the most, if the high priest is supposed to go from father to son, and on and on and on. There should have only been like 7 or 8 high priests, but there were 4 times that many. It changed hands that many times because it was all about who had the most money. And if you could pay the Greeks, or if you could pay the Romans at this time, the high priest spot is yours. You can have it. So the high priest position became one of what we call a venal state. It means you just pay for it. Just pay for it and you can become the high priest. And so the Jewish religion had become that false. That false. People were just paying to be the high priest. And so what does that cause? Well, that caused people to be in positions, ready, that they are not qualified for. How about that? Let's not even talk about moral qualifications. Let's just talk about the fact that they bought the spot with no faith in God, religion, understanding of the word at all. There were many high priests that were completely unqualified to be high priests. Yet they were high priests. Why? Because they had money. So they knew nothing about the law. They knew nothing about any of that. So what does that do? It increases the legal state, because now you have to have lawyers to actually interpret the law, Because the high priest doesn't know how to interpret the law anymore because he's not qualified, because the only reason he got the job is because he paid for it. So when you read the chief priests and the scribes are those lawyers. That mountain of lawyers, that mountain of wise men so because they had allowed the high priest to become paid, it created a whole class of lawyers. Does any of this sound familiar? So you have a false religious system. You have a society that's filled with lawyers interpreting that religious system. And then it gets worse. Because you get this word elders at the end. Well, elders is what's called the Great Sanhedrin. And the Great Sanhedrin is what? The Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court of the Jewish people. And at this point, the Supreme Court had swelled to 71 members. There were 71 people on the Sanhedrin. So you have a false religious system that can't understand religion anymore because it just pays to play. So that creates a system of lawyers that interprets the religion, which is going on now. Oh, you can say this, you can't say that. This is hate speech, this is not. And then you get a high court. Now remember, the high court was supposed to be ruled over by the high priest. But because 200 years ago, they started paying high priests to take the office, the high court says we can't trust the high priest to rule us anymore. So they have what's called a Nazi, or a high priest ruler, which is called the prince of the high council. And that's what they called it. So they had somebody who they selected from themselves to become the leader of the Great Sanhedrin, and the court no longer trusted